So, first of all, the first person that he needs acknowledged for hundreds of hours into these letters is sitting right back here. Cindy Ryan did the extraordinarily laborious job of doing the initial transcription of these letters. And as you know, a lot of these letters were written by men who were sick, who were sad, who were depressed, who some of them literally have they report saying things like, "I'm sorry I sent you that letter that was blotched," because they were crying when they wrote it. These letters are not always easy to transcribe. And after Cindy did all this work, I went through, just because in order to start getting them ready, our goal is to publish these letters as a book, and with just small historical context essays explaining what is being referenced in the letter. So like a paragraph or two when they're talking about being at Manassas Junction. What is he talking about? What is he references? What was Company A of the 24th Virginia doing there? So little essays. So I went back through, and I'm much more amateurish and don't have as much experience with transcriptions as Cindy. But I went through it and was reading her transcription against the letters. And all those letters, I found one single letter. Not a word, not a sentence. I found one single letter that could have been an A or could have been an O. And then we talked about it. We were like, it must have been an O just because of the context. So when we get there, I'll point that out to you because it's kind of a very interesting letter. And it has to do with a slusher, Jim, probably one of your, and Alice and all of the other slushers in here. Probably about half, right? So, Calohill Stigleman was born in 1833 in March, here in Floyd County. He, at about the age of 18 or 19, traveled to Philadelphia to study medicine. He returned to Floyd County to become a local doctor. Floyd only had about 5 or 6 doctors going into the Civil War, and that actually became an issue as well, which I'll touch on as we go through the letters. So he was a man who was not a warmonger. He was a man who was actually very hesitant to see the nation move towards the Civil War. And but when the war came, it was Calohill Stigleman who mustered Floyd's 1st Regiment. He became the captain. He did the groundwork. He organized Company A of the 24th Virginia. He presented it to Jubal Early, and that's where the Company A served. So we'll explore some of those going forward. Okay, these are just a couple examples of some of the letters addressed to Captain C.M. Stigleman. And it's important. And why do we do this? Because most of us do this all the time obsessively. Go on Amazon, look for new letter publications, look for new books that are coming out with Civil War collections or diaries. If you're like me, you hoard these things and buy them compulsively. But why is each one we come across important? Why do we here at the Historical Society care so much about the Stigleman letters? And there's another collection we're hoping to get transcribed and ready for publication here in the next few years too, who was a friend of Stigleman's. They knew each other, maybe not always friends. Maybe there was tension at times, but another local doctor. So we've got different perspectives, letter collections, that help us tell the story beyond the battles, beyond all of the primary source documents we have that are the battle reports. We go to the official records of the War of the Rebellion, and we read the battle reports and the orders, and we read the official military histories. But the letters, this gives us our glimpse into the actual real people who were living this experience, who were trying to make it day to day to day under the darkening sky of impending civil war. And then when the war came, just trying to navigate. Their whole world just blew up, exploded. Everything they knew about their life changed. And so these are real people trying to navigate real life in the midst of a war that was ripping them apart. And Floyd was not, this was not a large slaveholding county. In the 1860 census, there were just over I think it was 816, somewhere around 816, 830, somewhere in there, slaves in Floyd County. So why did Floyd end up sending them into the war if we didn't have, there's a lot of context, and these letters can help us understand why this happened. So each Civil War letter, even if there's only one in your family collection, it's important. And we would love to get a transcription of it. We would love to read it and get a scan of it, because each letter tells a tiny little piece of the story of the Civil War and what it was like in Floyd County. And we're going to start our story. Now, the letter collection of Calohill Stigleman starts when he was a young man. One of the earliest documents we have was his letter of introduction to the Methodist Church in Philadelphia, sent by the Methodist Church congregation here in Floyd, saying he was a member in good standing, which you had to have when he went to medical school in order to be active in the Philadelphia church. He had to have that letter of, he was in good standing. So it goes back to when he was a very young man. It tracks his heartache. There was a young lady named Molly. I guess she lived somewhere around Christiansburg. And she must have flirted with him, and he became infatuated, and then she dumped him and married somebody else. So Calohill Stigleman had a broken heart. And he returned to Floyd after medical school and started his practice. And this is exactly what you would expect from a small, very rural country practice. He set up an office in town, but most of it was, home visits. Most of it was on the road, on horseback, miles and miles and miles a day, taking care of the people of Floyd. That was the life he set up for. He got married to a Sheilah from Snowville, Ellen Sheilah. Her father's name was Thomas Sheilah, and they became the father-in-law. And Calohill became very close friends. They became even confidants. Some of the most enlightening and illuminating letters in this collection are not the letters between husband and wife, but father-in-law and son-in-law. Because when men wrote to their wives, they tended to buffer the worst of the situation. When you write to your wife and things are really bad, you're not going to tell her how awful it is, But the information we get from the letters with the father-in-law to Calohill give us a lot more information about the political background and underrumblings in Floyd during the time, the varying and growing dissent over political issues, because Floyd had its own political issues through this entire period. Questions related to people refusing to muster, men who, like the brethren, who were refusing to join the Confederate Army. A lot of these issues come out in the conversations between father-in-law and son-in-law. So those are really illuminating. Now I want to start here. This letter is fascinating because it takes us straight into the Secession Convention. Following the election of Abraham Lincoln and the secession of all the states in the Deep South, Virginia was still holding on. Virginia was still leaning towards standing with the Union, not seceding. So beginning in, the eastern counties were pushing hard. These western counties were not. So the Secession Convention started in Richmond in January 1861. And every county sent delegates to the convention to meet in this continual convention on the ordinance of secession. Was Virginia going to leave the Union or not? And January, February, and into March, we get a steady stream of communications between the convention back here to Floyd. And Floyd was at that point unanimously opposed to leading the Union at that point in time. And who you voted for, so your delegate was voted by a local referendum. You voted on your delegate. So that makes sense. You're going to vote on somebody who's going to represent the overwhelming perspective. So Floyd sent a pro-union delegate to the convention in Richmond. That was Harvey Deskin. Harvey remained a key player in Floyd County history until his death after the war. Throughout the Civil War, he was a mover and shaker at the courthouse. He was involved in so many aspects of the affairs of Floyd County. And this letter, dated March 16th from the Spotswood Hotel in Richmond, 1861, is him illuminating his absolute dedication to voting for union. He was reporting back to Calohill Stigleman that he was absolutely a staunch representative of Floyd's views that Virginia should not leave, that Virginia should not secede from the Union. And as of this date, it seems like a large percentage of the Floyd, we can't pull people right now. You know, we don't know how the percentages played out. But the vast majority of people at that point did not think that it was in Virginia's best interest to leave the Union in March of 1861. Certainly, the counties west of the Blue Ridge were leaning in that direction. Then we have a letter, notice the date, April 16th, 1861. Big things were happening those last week. You know, we have not only Fort Sumter, but for the residents of Floyd County and these rural communities. And some historians play this down, but I think for these rural mountain communities, this was the key factor. It was a significant factor in feeling betrayed by their own nation when Abraham Lincoln called for the 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. Now, Virginia was not in rebellion on April, at that point, Virginia was not in a state of rebellion when Lincoln called for those 75,000 volunteers. However, the Carolinas were. And if you're marching from D.C. to the Carolinas, in the perspective of these mountain populations, they were about to have an invasionary army from their own nation on their state territories. They were about to have their own nation march on them. And it scared people. I think it wasn't even at that point self-righteous anger. It was that feeling that our nation is about to use our military against us. And there were many other different contributing factors. But I think that for the Floyd County was one of the significant issues, was that knowledge that now things are getting real. There's going to be a military intervention to try and bring the states that have seceded, that are already forming a provisional government in Atlanta at that point. And they were going to try to be forced back into the Union. So by April 16th, we have evidence that Calohill Stigleman is already actively recruiting Company A of the 24th of Virginia, and he's trying to supply it. Because this is a letter from the state armorer for Virginia, for the Virginia State Militia. And he's reporting that, he has gotten the communication and application for Calohill Stigleman, who's asking for ammunition. So this was the first starting point of Calohill Stigleman starting to demonstrate that he had now shifted his alliances. Calohill Stigleman has reacted like most of the Floyd County, in that he has now gone from advocating in March for a preservation of the Union to actively enlisting for his own company, which he would soon become captain of. He had no military experience, like many Civil War generals. He brought zero experience in leadership of men in the military to this. But what he did bring was the local respect that made men trust him and want to follow him into battle anyway. So there was a large learning curve for a lot of these political officers, not just the generals. Okay. Can you see this one? In here, what we're looking at is this first initial process of how do we get ready for a war. Okay, the Confederacy, it's really important to understand the historical context of what the Confederacy was trying to pull off here. It had been attempted once. They were trying to form a new nation, declare independence, organize a new government, write a constitution, hold elections for their new government, and fight a war for independence at the exact same time. Now, their principle for how, could this possibly work was the American Revolution. Because that's exactly what we did with the American Revolution. The difference was France bankrolled our revolution. France funded our revolution. We had their navy, what point? Late 2 years into the revolution, 3 years into the revolution, 90% of our guns and 100% of our powder were coming from France. So the Confederacy doesn't have that luxury. They don't have France available to bankroll. So they're trying to organize an army, the logistics of an army, the quartermaster's office of an army. How do you feed an army if you don't even have a constitution? If you don't have the legal means to tax your population to pay for that army, how are you going to pay to feed that army? These were the logistical nightmares the Confederacy was dealing with. And each of these local field officers, like Calohill Stigleman, had to take on a lot of the responsibility, especially early in the war, for supplying and feeding their companies. And so Calohill Stigleman raised the funds. I'm sure a lot of it came out of his own pocket, for orders. Like here we have percussion muskets, bayonets for the muskets. I'm trying to see, a whole list of, I apologize. I just skipped several slides. Okay, it's small on my screen. Cartridges and caps. These are orders that Calohill Stigleman is placing, probably largely out of his own funds, out of his own money, because these men are showing up, enlisting in his company, and some of them have no guns. Some of them have, the shotguns they've been using to squirrel hunt. That doesn't really do you a whole lot of good on a field of battle. These are the logistical nightmares they were dealing with. April, May, June, even into July, even as we marched into, the first battle of Manassas, the logistical nightmare. Yeah.
Who was he ordering bayonets from?
I'd have to go back and see.
For example,
well, some of it they were going to Early, and then Early was ordering them through his channels. Some of it was being brought in through the new Confederate government, because in the last month between the election of Lincoln in March or April, a lot of soon to abscond members of Congress and people in cabinet positions in the federal government used their positions to move a tremendous amount of military armaments to Southern arsenals. So a lot of it was confiscated from federal arsenals in the South. So there was a wide variety. And some of it they just ordered privately. I don't think Calohill Stigleman could have afforded to do that. But some of the larger plantation owner counties, they did just they just paid it out of their own pockets, some of them. So there's a lot of, actually we probably need a book just on that. All of the different ways that, they've done. There have been some really good looks at the seizure of federal arsenals and forts and military supplies across the entire South. So, and then we get a new reality. This second letter here is Calohill Stigleman writing back to his wife. And there's a back and forth of letters, husband to wife here, that's revealing of her adapting to having a husband who's now in the military, where she doesn't know where he's at or what he's doing at any given time. And she is, it doesn't say here, but she's probably at this point about, let's see, what month is this? Yeah, she's 8 months pregnant. So she's pregnant. Her husband's just left for war. She's got a toddler in the house. And like a lot of wives whose husband suddenly went off to join the Confederate armies, she expected to know where he was at all times. She expected that he would be able to write to her every day and get letters back to her consistently every day. And in some of these letters, she's kind of berating him a little bit. Like, you said you were in Richmond. What do you mean you're in no, she thought he was in Lynchburg. And she thought he was going to be staying in Lynchburg. And that's where he was going to spend the war in Lynchburg. And then she found out how he moved to Richmond. And then she found out they were marching north towards Manassas Junction. And she was not dealing very well with that. Having her husband suddenly on the march, not being able to communicate with her on a daily basis where she was. And of course, the fear of being 8 months pregnant and suddenly having all of this tremendous stress. So Ellen was having some adaptation problems and some issues with adjusting to this life. So she ended up going back to Snowville and moving back in with her parents especially during her confinement. So really about 6 or 8 months at least. She stayed in Snowville with her family. That's where the baby was born. And that's where she stayed because she needed that support system. They had a small son who had continual digestive issues. He was about 2 years old. And the letters continually report this child having digestional, I don't even know what they might have been. It sounds like extreme diverticulitis or something this child was suffering with. So she had all of these complications, a semi-unhealthy toddler, a new baby. And so the letters are revealing, and that we see this across other Civil War letters, as the wives had to adapt to having their husbands gone. And they had to adapt to taking on roles in the family that traditionally they wouldn't have had to do. She wouldn't have had to worry about things like ordering firewood for the winter or sending the horse to be shoed, or, those were not tasks that were in her area of expertise or on her to-do list. But now they have to be on her to-do list. And so the women had a lot of adjustment. Okay, and some of these letters are further going and exploring how now they're moving towards Manassas Junction. So if you look at the date, we got June 14th, 1861. The clock is ticking. And we've already had some minor skirmishes. Company A of the 24th Virginia has not seen action yet. But they're stationed outside of Manassas Junction, and we're less than a month now from the first battles. He's writing back to her. Here we have June 17th. Trying to update her on where exactly they're stationed, what they're doing, how his troops and how his men are adapting to camp life. He himself was starting to have some difficulties with camp life. By August, September, they were shipping him medicines because he was dealing with dysentery and some of the chronic camp complaints that were so common in the Civil War. And he was a master of self-diagnosis, which I'll get into here in a minute. It's a miracle he survived some of his own cures. But he's taking medications, but he's trying to be very positive with her. She's only, days away from delivering this baby, less than a month away from delivering this baby. And he's going on not only managing his affairs in the camp, but he's also giving her guidance on managing his affairs at home and the household affairs, and continually concerned about her health and their son. So a lot of his letters, large sections of his letters, are just focused on his children. Is he okay? What are you feeding him? You've got to stick with the diet I told you to feed him because he can't he can't handle certain other foods. So it'd be interesting, actually, in hindsight, to try and diagnose this continual complaint that the child has. It seems he eventually outgrew it. I'm just trying to read through some of these. Okay, some of these, we start to see communications from Hiram Floyd. And this one's Hobach, Dr. Hobach, A.J. Hobach. There were several doctors in Floyd, and they started to try and coordinate how they were going to manage having a certain number of them enlist in the Confederate Army and serve as doctors, because right now Floyd's missing a doctor. Calohill Stigleman was one of the most active doctors right here around town and surrounding areas, but now he's off playing soldier, being captain of the Company A of the 24th Virginia, a task that probably he would have been better suited to appoint himself or put himself in as physician. He probably would have been better. So now we're running into an issue where some of the fitter, healthier physicians in Floyd are suggesting that they themselves would like to go and volunteer as surgeons with the Confederate Army. However, they can't leave Floyd without any doctors. So the doctors of Floyd are now trying to figure out the logistics of how do we take care of our population here in Floyd? How do we make sure we have enough doctors in Floyd to care for the people of Floyd? But then a significant number of us, like the 3 or so of us, need to go volunteer, not as captains, not as officers, but as surgeons, as physicians in the Confederate Army. And we see a steady letter during this period of back and forth between these physicians. And some of the physicians in Floyd were not particularly popular. I can't remember the name. There was one in particular that Hoback says, we got this guy, but nobody likes him. And so that's not going to work out because nobody wants to go to him. Nobody wants to see him. So we can't count on him to be a physician to take care of Floyd County. So now they have to start considering, should Calohill Stigleman continue in the Confederate Army? Should he remain captain of Company A, even this early before the first battles? Or should he come back and take on the duties of county physician and let somebody else, like Hoback, who was really pushing, he was very antsy, to volunteer, to be a surgeon. So they're trying to start to figure out the logistics of how do you manage both. You know, we've got this feeling of obligation to serve the Army and serve the Confederacy, but our first and primary obligation is the citizens of Floyd who don't have enough doctors. And it was in one of these letters, it may have been this one, I'll have to look, that the first mention of the issues that would soon plague Floyd with the Brethren Church, and some of you came for that that talk, last year we focused on that. The first mention of men refusing to muster, refusing to enlist. The first mention of men who are evading conscription. And the first ones mentioned are Christian and Peter Bowman. The Bowman brothers, their father Christian, had just broken away from Topeka Church and started Red Oak Grove Church of the Brethren. So just in like the 1858, 1859, Christian Bowman was planting the Red Oak Grove congregation. And the Red Oak Grove congregation then put it in proximity to Pine Creek Primitive Baptist and the Mill. So now we're thinking about that vicinity where we started to soon a lot of desertion. A lot of support for deserters started to come from that area of Floyd. And Christian Bowman, as a brethren, and there's strong evidence to implicate that they were involved with the Unionist Underground Railroad as the war progressed. His sons were refusing to muster. So the first mention of that shows up in these letters during this period. We're like, nope, they're not going to muster. Now, eventually they ended up paying the $500 fees. First they had to pay it to the state. Then all the laws changed and they had to pay it again to the Confederate government because there was complications. They thought once they paid it to the state, they were clear. But then they later had to pay the government, the Confederate government. So this was the first indication of the breach within the county of men who were not going to support the war effort, not because they supported the Union over the Confederacy, but because they were fundamentally opposed to war, period. So it's not that they were Unionists, they would be accused of being Unionist. I think we've pretty much debunked that theory. They weren't Unionists, they were just pacifist. They were peace church peoples. So Calohill Stigleman was monitoring the situation intently while he was away at war. And then when he returned to Floyd, we don't have clear, strong documentation, but we have references that he remained very much on top of what was happening with these groups and these men who, based on their peace church principles, were refusing to serve. I know where my sister lives, actually, and interesting, it's nice to place your own location. My sister lives next door to me. We live right beside Topeka Church. And we have found in the records that was the Brethren. That whole area was Brethren, 100% Brethren. Right there on the corner of what's now her property is where they were making saltpeter. So they were collecting all the manure from all the chicken houses, and they were producing the saltpeter. And that's one of the things a lot of the Brethren were able to contribute. Like if they would produce saltpeter, then that would be an exemption from service, because that's still it's considered contribution to the war effort. to produce the saltpeter. Okay, here we have I.H. Slusher. And Jim, I apologize. Last time we talked, I thought this was a Weddell. For some reason, I remembered it wrong. It wasn't a Weddell, it was a Slusher. And this is one of my favorite letters of the war. I.H. Slusher was home here in Floyd. This was written to Stigleman from Culpeper, or from Greasy Creek. So everybody knows where Greasy Creek at if you think about Alum Ridge and Greasy Creek section. I.H. Slusher wrote to Stigleman in camp and said, I am so sorry. I've been in bed 2 weeks. I've got the typhus. He says, I've got the typhus and I have as much business above ground as a mole right now. He really did not think he had a survivable illness. This was the only letter, because if you look at the letter, his loop comes off of the O halfway down, even probably 2/3 of the way down, so it looked like an A. So at first we were like, was he writing male or mole? But then in the context of the sentence, mole seems like, so he had as much business above ground as a mole. I did look him up, and he recovered, returned to Company A, served through a significant portion of the war, and if I recall off the top of my head, he lived till about 1914, and he's buried, I think, out on Laurel Creek, or Laurel,
Blanche.
Yes, I can't speak. Little Branch. Okay, so this is where he's talking about, I have the typhoid fever and have not got much more business above ground than a mole at the time. So if you can tell, read his handwriting right there. That was his admission that he expected, he was on death's doorstep.
And scroll down to his signature. All right, do we know that's I.H. or could it possibly be J.H.?
Well, see, and that's what I've wondered. J.H., I've thought that J.H. now consistently his initial looks the same. And we were both leaning towards I, but J.H. would make sense. If it's J.H., who would it be?
Jeremiah Haynes, Slusher.
That probably makes more sense.
Jim's grandfather. Well,
My great
ancestor.
Well, I'm glad he stayed above ground, or we might not have you. I always tell my family that too. Like, when you study your family's role in the Civil War, I had two ancestors on my mom's side who served with the Union, pulled out of the heavy artillery at D.C. and thrown in at Cold Harbor. These were the guys that were putting their name and address on their back to make it easier for the grave diggers. And they were like 18 and 19. And I always tell my family, hey, they made it. One was taken prisoner, one was injured, but it's a good thing because they went home and got married and we're all here now because, so this would have, okay, so let's, you know what, Cindy, I think we'll go probably double check that and verify that he served with the 24th, which makes sense because I'm sure he did.
Family history has he was a captain of militia. Now, his two brothers went to the 30th Battalion, and another brother went to the 54th Virginia. But our record shows that J.H. was actually a captain of militia and was basically at that point home guard.
Oh, that would make sense too. So I think what this means is we've just opened up a whole new line of inquiry, and we're going to have to really dig into if he was never part of the 24th Virginia, but he's reporting back to Stigleman, was that just his friendship, or was he just letting him know that he wasn't serving in any capacity in the Home Guard? So I think that's grounds for a little more digging to answer, this has opened more questions. I love it. So he survived, and that's the important part there. Okay. As we move through these, you're going to find, and I think we're going to have other opportunities as we move forward for more conversations like this, because this reads like a who's who of Floyd County ancestry. The letters to and from Stigleman and the people they reference in in these letters. There's I'm probably the only one in this room who doesn't have kin referenced on this, in these letters. Oh yeah. Well, we're the token Yankees. It's all right. Okay.
Are names in this particular letter?
In this particular letter, I don't think so. This is a letter, the Sheilah. This is a letter where he's reporting to Calohill that his daughter has been born. But through here, when you go through all of the letters, they're all of the names from Quisenberry to you name it, they're all mentioned in these letters. So, this is dated July 12th. So the clock's ticking to the first significant battles. But from Snowville, this is he wrote T-H-O, G. Sheilah, but it was Thomas G. Sheilah. The father-in-law wrote to tell Calohill Stigleman that his wife Ellen was not doing well, but that's because lying by her side is as fine a plump, fat, and nice little daughter as you ever put your eyes upon. It was born last night at 3 o'clock. And he also puts, he doesn't minimize the difficulty of childbirth, but he does say that it was as easy a time or easier birth as one could hope for. So he was also reassuring Calohill Stigleman, even if there had been some difficulties, he probably would not have reported that to the husband off at war. But from all, later letters that we have, because they started sending daily reports, this is how Ellen and the baby are doing. This is how Ellen and the baby are doing. They're doing okay. There were continual reports on how they were doing and that everything was okay and the baby was thriving. The interesting thing about this, as you look through the letters over the next 3-4 months, there was no rush to name that baby. And that was very common. It was not uncommon to wait sometimes as much as a year to name a baby. You don't want to get too attached when there was such a high infant mortality rate in the first year. Not to mention the fact that this was the period when the diphtheria outbreak was picking up steam. By 1862, 1863, this entire region would be in the clutches of a horrific diphtheria outbreak. Some families lost 3 and 4 children in a couple-week period. One of the Weddles out by Topeka lost 2 sons in 1 week to diphtheria. So diphtheria was just, ripping through this county. And diphtheria is particularly preys on the young who have no immunity, no resistance. So young children were the most susceptible to death from diphtheria. So there was no rush. It was even at Christmas. It's some of the letters, they're starting to toss around, well, what are we going to actually stick with for a name? Till they finally, came up with and decided on a name for the baby. So one of the things, I'm going to move ahead to some of these. There's some particular letters that I think are significant to understanding Calohill Stigleman and Floyd in the war. And I want to make sure I save some time here to take a deeper dive into Calohill Stigleman's role in Floyd after the war. Because Calohill Stigleman probably said and did more to help heal the nation and heal the county from the damage of the war than almost any other figure I can say. He was, come to find out, a brilliant speaker. And he had a knack for saying just the right words and just the right thing to resonate and connect with people and help people move forward after the war and put the war behind them. And I want to make sure I have a few minutes to kind of dive into those. Okay, this was another letter from T.G. Sheilah talking about the baby, but then also dated July 20th, talking about he heard they were fighting at the junction. Well, I suppose that the long-dreaded period has come at last. So words coming in that there had been fighting at Manassas Junction at Bull's Run. Words getting back that things are happening. And the Floyd Company A of 21st Virginia had been stationed closer to the junction. And their role, they had actually eyes on the railroad. So they were involved in the battle, but more in kind of a skirmishing capacity. They were not actually in the heart of the fighting at Manassas. So they were kind of off. Now they were under fire, and they were definitely becoming seasoned in that battle. But they were not, in the heart of the most vicious fighting at Manassas Junction. And some of the letters after this reference that, but it's interesting because Calohill Stigleman himself did not put, kind of event by event, action by action, battle replays into his letters. Even to friends and family, I guess he reserved that for when he spoke to them in person. He did not go in depth into what he saw and felt and experienced at Manassas Junction. He kind of saved that or kept it off the record. So I have to just remind myself. This is another reference here. I think the main reason they're talking about considerable sickness beginning in the county. That was probably most likely the diphtheria outbreak taken off. And there could have been a variety of other things as well. Dr. Howard's and candidate leave next through Tuesday. They're leaving to volunteer as surgeons, I believe, at that point. I will have my hands full. Dr. Hines is daily becoming more unpopular. I hope nobody here descended from Dr. Hines. You're not descended from Dr. Hines, are you? Okay. Dr. Hines, I don't know what Dr. Hines was doing. I don't know why the people of Floyd didn't like him. But that was leaving Hobeck with more on his plate. So from here on out, he kind of starts to edge Stigleman to come back to Floyd. Like when his enlistment's up, because these first enlistments were very brief. First, 3 months, and then 6 months, and then a year, and then 2 years. And then finally, the Confederacy got smart and said, if you're in till the end. But they had to keep changing the terms, the duration of their enlistments. So this is more attempts to figure out how in the world to keep enough physicians in the county to handle Floyd, especially with these illnesses breaking out all over the county. If you go back to like some of the death records, we have some of the death records in the books in the museum. If you go through them, you see clusters of deaths with one family name, days apart. Those are almost all diphtheria deaths. And if you go to a lot of the county cemeteries, one of the great cemeteries to actually walk around and see this, if you go out to Willis and walk up around the cemetery, you'll see all of these rows of tiny little markers with no names on them. Those were all children, and a lot of them, they're bracketed by, the dates of people that died during the same period. So a lot of those are going to be diphtheria deaths during this, the next couple of years. Yes?
Sheila, there is a community just south of Czech, a whole community, every member of the community wiped out with diphtheria in 1863.
That makes sense. Are they mostly in one cemetery?
You're listed in the cemeteries, yes, for that area.
Okay, so we need to go back and look at those. During this time, one of the Bowman brothers, Peter Bowman, died during this period. And he was a young man too. I've never found any death certificate on him. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means I haven't looked in the right place and I haven't found his death certificate. It probably is quite possibly even digitized. But because of his age, I don't suspect foul play or anything nefarious because he wasn't popular. The Bowmans were not popular because they were refusing to muster. But I actually suspect that he died of disease, possibly diphtheria, because as the sons of a prominent minister, they would have been involved with tending to the ill, visiting the ill. They would have been some of the groups of people that were around diphtheria patients the most. So he certainly would have been exposed to diphtheria. So that's on my to-do list, is to urgently figure out what happened to him. What killed Peter Bowman? The Epperly, Tazewell Epperly, is that name familiar? Tazewell Epperly? Tazewell Epperly was killed in battle. And And the father was desperate to get his son's body brought back to Floyd. And they were unsure how to do that. Later in the war, they became very good. There were actually people who essentially started businesses doing reinterments. You know what I mean? They would go and bring people home, and it was not pleasant business. But people wanted their sons home. And so here we have B. Hilton. What Hilton would that have been? B. Just your best guess. I knew if she was here, she would be able to help us with all kinds of genealogy. He was writing and supporting Joseph Epperly's efforts to get his son Tazewell brought back to Floyd. Cost was expected to be $5 to $7 to get his son brought home. So I included this letter just because this was the very human reality that families were facing all over the county. You know, do you let your fallen son lie where he's out on the battlefield? And I can understand the parents feeling that, you know what I mean, from the parents' perspective, that you would not sleep well, you know, unless, you know, perhaps you had your son buried in the family plot. You wanted your son brought home. So this letter is exploring, you know, their efforts. You know which? This was January 21st, 62. So he probably would have died in either...
The sheriff wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And that Bryant,
Oh, that would make sense.
I think he was the sheriff. I think that was the name of one of the sheriffs.
Okay, now that would make sense because the sheriff might get involved with putting his weight behind. Yeah.
Sheila, 70% of the population was illiterate at that time, so they would have had to be people writing for them.
Well, that's true too. And that a lot of these, the handwriting, yeah, you can see.
Also, Brian Hilton had a hotel right here in the center of Floyd, and individuals would send things to the hotel as a place that others could come to pick up items.
Right. That makes sense. So that might be why he was engaged in helping to facilitate bringing the body home of Tazewell Epperly. So, I mean, Epperleys were a key name, and, you know, across, you know, I mean, we'd have to look it up and see exactly which Epperly this was, too. Anybody have a Joseph Epperly in their genealogy? Okay. So I included this one because this happened quite a bit during the war as people tried to get their sons brought home and get their sons interred in their family plots. Okay, now this one, I actually asked Grok AI to give me a summary of what would happen if you medicated yourself this way. Calohill Stigleman suffered tremendously from neuralgia, and that's hard enough to treat today. You know, it's difficult to manage neuralgia with modern pharmaceuticals. At this time, the causes were little understood, and so the best he could do was try and mute the symptoms. But he suffered at different times in his life of debilitating neuralgia. Like he was like, you know, he just couldn't function. It got so bad. And as we get to January 1862, he had one of these episodes. Camp life was not suiting Calohill Stigleman very well. He was not of that very tough fiber physically to withstand camp life. He was dealing with continual bouts of dysentery and continual health problems. And then, not surprisingly, he had these severe bouts of neuralgia. And as part of this, finally, in the morning, I took a large dose of morphia, then belladonna, and in a few hours took brandy. And by 12 o'clock, I could sleep. So I was like, okay, so I'm going to look this up. And my sister's a medicinal chemist. So she explained it to me with really big words, the dangers. So then I was like, okay, well, thank you, sister. But let's see if Grok has an idea. So I actually made some notes. I asked AI. I hope I have my note here. I said, AI. And I explained there was a Civil War physician. He was a doctor. He suffered from severe neuralgia. And this was his home treatment. This is how he remedied himself. And Grok AI was like, oh my. Like, okay, oh, wait, I'm not seeing the whole notes. I don't want to read the whole thing to you anyway. But Grok went on and gave all of the effects of morphine, as we know what morphine does. But then when you add belladonna can have extreme impacts on cardiac rhythm. It can cause arrhythmia. It can cause your heart to just suddenly stop if you misdose it. And when you combine morphine with belladonna, belladonna is a nightshade. It's an herbal remedy that I don't think even the most, educated herbalist would dare give somebody belladonna anymore. It's very powerful. And then when he added whiskey to that to further slow his respirations and his entire ability to process what he's putting in his body, it's no wonder he slept. And according to Grok, according to AI, it really is amazing that he woke up. Now, we don't know the dosage. Now, we can only assume that the dosage was small enough, that this was... But this could have been like an unintentional suicide type scenario to give yourself this. And he did this several more times until he returned home from the war. 1 or 2 more letters, he reports that he had to take the morphine belladonna combination. He didn't always report taking the whiskey with it. That must have been like that point of last resort. Because as a physician, he had to have known what the combination of morphine and whiskey, himself. He's admitting it to his wife. He's telling his wife that this is how he treated his neuralgia. And it seems like this, because he refers to the combination of morphine and belladonna several more times, it must have been his go-to treatment for neuralgia. So, and when you think about it, where were we in terms of pharmacology, during the Civil War? This was well before Rockefeller took over the pharmaceutical industries, you know what I mean? So we really didn't have that foundation. Most doctors practiced herbal medicine tremendously. If you go across, almost any county and find like the physicians, the local doctors, they kept huge herb gardens around their houses. They grew echinacea and comfrey and you name it. They grew everything. Chicory, they grew everything that they could to try and, treat patients, with what were tried and true herbal remedies. I had, until I read this letter, not come across somebody who actually used belladonna. I had read that it could be used, but I had not actually read anybody using belladonna as a medical treatment because it's such a dangerous nightshade. So don't try that at home.
So in January of 62, was he serving as the company commander or company surgeon or both?
No, company commander. Yeah, he was not the surgeon. He was still captain. And there's some questions because in his letters to his wife, he's reporting that his men loved him. But it seems like some of his men didn't love him so much. And I think there was probably a lack of the military experience that the men started to notice. By this point in the war, men would rather live with, or function under, officers who were tough and strict, but got things done efficiently and made sure the food arrived on time and the blankets arrived on time and the ammunition arrived on time. And the non-military political officers, they cared about their men. They knew when their wife was having a baby and they knew what so-and-so's name was and they knew the human side, but they tended to be lacking in the efficient governance and application of military duties. And I think we started to run into that with Stigleman at this time.
At this point in time, the company still elected their own officers.
Yes. But he would come home at the end of this year. Like when he hit 1 year of service, he came home. So he never referenced it, but it seems like he was, don't re-enlist. So the company captain was replaced. I'd have to double check in the regimental history book, but it was about April or June. Company A elected a new captain, and Stigleman ended up coming home at that point and served the rest of the war from home.
I find it very interesting that the Confederacy allowed him to be a military officer as opposed to a surgeon.
And that's interesting, and I think later in the war they would not have done that. As the war progressed, they would not have allowed the talent of a surgeon to be served as an officer, probably. Right. Well, but when you look at the broader, what was happening all across the South, in those first few months of the war, the rush to be the person to muster the first company and the first regiment in your county, in your region, to bring the first, complete company and then the first complete regiment, and you show up and you volunteer to Early and his grit and his army together. And the rush to do that meant they didn't give a whole lot of thought to credentials. They gave more thought to who could draw enlistments. And men who were popular in their counties drew enlistments.
Do you have any letters, correspondence with Jacob Helms, who had more slaves than anyone else in the area? And Stigleman and Jacob Helms had connections. And and in thinking about Helms, did some of that money?
Well, that would make a lot of sense. I would think that Helms probably did. Whether or not there's a paper trail, there's a pretty good chance. I'm trying to think. There are not many, if any, letters to or from Helms in this collection. But that doesn't mean they don't exist, and I can't imagine they weren't corresponding throughout the entire period. Like it's like almost, a given. They would have been corresponding. Was he a Presbyterian or a Methodist?
Well, the reason I ask is we all remember and love Margaret Smith.
Right.
And Margaret's belief through what her father had shared was that there was actually a familial relationship, Jacob Helms and Calohill Stigleman.
Huh.
So
Okay, there's our next mystery we have to dig into. So could I wouldn't see why not. There could have been a relation on his mother's side.
well, very close, let me say.
Okay. Oh, wait. Okay, you can say it. Nobody's going to be upset. They're dead. Calohill Stigleman was a bastard. He was a bastard child. He was raised by his mother. It's okay to say that because they're gone and they're not going to come get us. So could that have played?
Through Margaret Smith sharing at different points in time, and Alice and I visited in her home with her, and she was certain of a location where her father had written that information down, that Calohill Stigleman was the son of Jacob.
That would make sense. Yeah, because maybe it was Margaret who told me, but we know he was definitely, there's no father on the birth certificate. That would make sense. Do you know where that stuff went when her home was?
Oh, she never found it. She
didn't find it when we were there, and I'm not sure. But
She had
she
so much
was
stuff
very
in that house.
adamant that that was her father's absolute belief.
I mean, until proven one way or the other. I mean, her facts were usually pretty
And
solid.
Jacob Helms considered to be the bank.
For the
He was
companies.
the one with the wealth
Right,
to whom people went.
right. That would make a lot of sense, actually.
I'd like to know what business was Mr. Collins in at the time that he required so many slaves?
Everything.
Yeah,
Banking, farming, a little bit of
he
everything.
had a lot of land. I think he had several tracts of land around Floyd, didn't he?
He did.
And
Yeah.
wanted to have the courthouse there.
He built Rose Hill, so on Rose Hill Drive.
beside the fallen branch.
And Stigleman was born near Rose Hill too. And that's not that far from, actually you think about it, that's not even that much far. When you go back to the Epperly boy, we have to check in that because that's not that far from, as the crow flies, that's not that far from the mill. And okay, see, the puzzle.
Stigleman get his name then?
His mother.
His mother.
Yeah. And she was alive during the war. There's references to his ma. So, but I'd have to look it up and see when she died.
Something else too, you gotta realize that somebody paid those bills for him to go to Philadelphia.
Yeah.
And there weren't many people that would have been able to do that around here but Jacob Helm.
And yeah, there was no scholarships for medical school. And he was there for, 3 or 4 years for medical school. So see? I love a good mystery. Someday they'll try to figure this stuff out about us. Okay, so after the war, last thing before I switch out. Most of you have read the Stoneman's raid, and when Stoneman came through Floyd, it was actually Calohill Stigleman who rode up Rose Hill with the white flag and surrendered Floyd to the Union cavalry. So Floyd did officially surrender. It was about April 5th, about April 4th or April 5th. I'd have to double check my dates. 1865, when Floyd surrendered, just a few days before Lee surrendered at Appomattox. So, and it was Stigleman who rode out, just trying to keep Stoneman from potentially firing the cannons and damaging the courthouse and damaging, records. They wanted, at that point, just to get Stoneman out of town with no damage or additional loss of life. There was one man killed out in Willis as Stoneman came into Floyd. And they didn't want anybody else killed. They couldn't see any point in picking a fight with Stoneman in the Home Guard. So they just surrendered the county. I think that was probably prudent. After the war, Stigleman remained and even became more of one of Floyd's most prominent citizens. The South was running way behind the North in school systems, in public school systems and access to public schools. Most of these small schoolhouses, the one-room schoolhouses that Floyd, we've done, a lot of research into these schoolhouses. Most of them were built in the post-war period. That's when a lot of these little schoolhouses popped up all around the county and education became accessible. Calohill Stigleman was the first superintendent of schools for Floyd County. He was beloved in that position. He remained a prominent and active figure in the Methodist Church in the Floyd in town. And he remained active as a physician until he got too old to see patients. He never ran, that I know of, for political office beyond being appointed superintendent of schools. I think that's as close as he came to, political office. That wasn't his interest. He wasn't a politician at heart. After the war, he spoke at length on, especially later in his life, in the years before he died, he spoke at length on healing the nation, on how important it was for the North and the South, and the Confederate veterans and the Union veterans, and the citizens to see each other as one nation under the one flag, standing together, because he understood very powerfully how important a strong United States, I think he even understood it from the world stage. I think he understood the bigger picture. When he died in 1905, we were on the cusp of World War I. And he was seeing the industrialized United States becoming an international powerhouse. And he realized, and he strongly advocated for healing the wounds of war if we were going to remain a viable leader on the, one, just survive as a nation, two, become a world leader. And some of these speeches, I have anybody who's interested in reading the entire thing, you can leave me your email up here, and I'll email you copies of the entire speeches. Because some of these were very powerful.
That letter in particular
Very well written.
Yeah, should I read it out loud or are y'all reading it to yourselves? Okay. And while we shall ever strive to revere and hold in sacred memory all our battlefields as paraphernalia of war, we no less honor the brave and loyal soldier of the North who followed the lead of that gallant and gentleman soldier, General Grant. Maybe the only person to call Grant a gentleman. They were true to their native states and followed the lead of the governors of their respective commonwealths. That's important. People still identified with their state first. You were a Virginian first, and then you were an American. What else could they have done? Brave soldiers of the North, I honor you. Welcome, thrice welcome to the South. And why we were honored alike in arms, as I said before, by the nations of the world, who could be so corrupt to deny us the privilege to honor our dead alike in days of peace. Let me read that again. Who could be so corrupt to deny us the privilege to honor our dead alike in days of peace? All hail the white flag of peace, blessed gospel messenger. All hail united country. May the bonds of peace grow stronger as generations after generations shall go down into the tomb ere another fratricidal war shall dissolve the bonds of this union. The government of the United States has no more courageous and loyal friends than the people of the South, who know no fear when their flag is in peril, and all we ask as true and law-abiding citizens is that the general government extend to us the equality of rights and general privileges that are accorded citizens in other portions of the Union. That's a message of healing, of putting it in the past. The past is done. We're looking ahead. And some of his other ones, he wrote so beautifully about Virginia. Do we have a few minutes? I don't mind reading these. I find them powerful. Okay, and on his love of Virginia. Let nothing come between you and your love of Virginia. And now, fellow comrades, while I look in your eyes, perhaps for the last time he was meeting with Confederate veterans, I know you will join with me in this tribute to Virginia. Virginia, you art the land of love, land of my natal hours. Every square foot of your territory is dear to me. 'Tis thine, 'tis mine, 'tis Virginia's. Thy rivers, bays, sluggish creeks, and little gurgling rills, and distant mountains blue, where sparkling streams of limpid waters pure come dashing down the mountainside, and madly leap from crag to crag, then round and round in eddies turn, then off they pour in caverns deep and eternal roar. Scenes of my childhood, I love thee still, thy rocks on rocks and massive stratas piled, all clad in moss and flowers wild, thy forest grand of giant trees and waving ferns of evergreen, thy towering peaks and laurels clad, and seam with leafy green to brush the blue vault of the skies over which thy towering summit lies. I love them too. The quiet hours out on the farm, the old crossroads and country store, with here and there a meeting house where gospel truth as freely falls as fall the forest leaves. 'Tis here the people love to congregate and grip each other's hands in friendship's recognition, and in groups beneath the trees speak freely of things that have come to pass since they last met. There's something good in all of this, and all is old Virginia-like, and it pleases us who hath aught to say of our way of doing. The little humble country towns, as well as cities proud, I love them all. The old broomsedge field, all gullied with red, the old log cabin with its leaning, crumbling tiers tottering to its fall, and at the old house place, all overgrown with catnip and comfrey, stands the old stone chimney, silent and alone like a sentinel over the dead. I love for the long, long ago. He was waxing a little poetic, but it's a beautiful ode to growing up in Floyd County. You know, you can kind of picture what he's seeing and what he's describing, you know, when we drive or ride around. In one of the letters, he describes riding back on a cold winter's night from seeing a patient, and it's dark, and it's January, and it's cold, and we've all driven these places, we love them, when our dirt roads dip down to those tight little creeks, and there's laurel on both sides, and if you stop and you just stand and all you hear is the creek, and at that point laurel makes its own sound. And if you can imagine yourself being on horseback. I've done it because I used to sneak out in the middle of the night on the horse. In those little hideaway places. You know what I mean? Riding home at 2 a.m. from a patient in the cold of January, and all you would hear would be the horse's feet, which would sound like cannons probably on a frozen ground. And the creeks, that's what he's describing. You can see how much he loved Floyd. Like this man epitomized what it means to live in these mountains. And he was very true to that until his death. Here's Stigleman, only a couple of months before he died. He had a lot of reasons for wanting to see that monument placed in front of the courthouse. And he took the lead, and he fought hard because, and it wasn't for any concept of, he does mention the lost cause briefly, but he doesn't speak of the lost cause in the way that the generals spoke of it. He spoke of this monument being a tribute to the men of Floyd who fought off for Virginia to defend Virginia. And that's the most important thing we have to keep in mind when we consider why these men fought so hard for these monuments. The Confederate soldiers, these young men who mustered out of Floyd, were not marching off to fight for the Confederacy first. They were fighting for Virginia. They were fighting for Virginia's autonomy, Virginia's independence. And whether if not we look back on it in hindsight, and we can, from our pedestal of, all of these years, take the moral high ground if we want. And you make all kinds, right or wrongs of what they were fighting for. But from their perspective, they were fighting to protect hearth and home, and farm and family and children. And that's why they mustered. And that's why Calohill Stigleman fought so hard to get that monument placed. He wasn't saying he advocated for slavery. The man never owned a slave. He wasn't a slave owner. I've never read one single thing that suggests that he even supported the institution. I don't know if he supported the institution. It seems like he may have been educated from the institution. We'll have to work on that. But he himself, even if his father was a slave owner, he was not. So we don't know exactly what his perspectives were on slavery aspect of, but that's not why these men marched off to war.
You make a lot of good reason for us not taking down our Civil War monuments like we are doing.
Right. That's why, you can't erase it. And each man who went off to war went on his own set of motivations and his own set of moral reasoning for why he was marching off to war. And for the men in these mountains, preserving the peculiar institution was not on the list. The few slaveholders in Floyd that could afford a slave paid for somebody else to go fight on their behalf. It was the poor boys, it was the farm boys of Floyd who marched off to war. That's who fought. Right. The Brethren Church tried to raise as much as they could, but Floyd wasn't as wealthy as some of the bigger brother congregation, and they couldn't raise that much money. And then there's two more listings here. This is his obituary. Dr. Stigleman breathed his last peacefully and quietly on Sunday, the 29th of January at 4:30 p.m. And then he was born on Rose Hill on the 13th of March. And here, P.F. Shelton was talking about, and I've wondered, could that be P.F. Shelton? I'm trying to figure out who this is. We'll put Janet on it. We need to figure out who that is, the second man in that picture. It was. You're right. Okay. They should say who was there. Okay. So this is his obituary, and they talked about his dedication to the nation and healing the country, and his dedication to Floyd and his tireless work to save Floyd after and reunite the nation after the war. So good, bad, or ugly, Calohill Stigleman served this county from childhood until death. And his entire world was wrapped up in the citizens of this county. The letters revealed to us, as you read them, there isn't military history in any of these letters. These are not military Civil War letters. He barely mentions anything to do with military history of the period. His entire focus in these letters are the people, the human beings of Floyd County. That's who he cared about. His family, his friends. He cared about the politics. He cared about these things in Floyd County, and that's what the letters give us a glimpse into. That's why, for me, they're valuable as a Floyd County history, because we get this little peek into what was happening here when the world was falling apart. And the last thing some of you might be interested in, I think I mixed some of these up. This was in his letters, in his collection, his listing of the men from Floyd who served and where they served. Now, this is not an extant list. This is not complete. I don't even have a date for when he compiled this list. But when we compare it to other lists we have, there are a lot of names repeating. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up there. I hope you guys kind of feel a little bit more intrigued, that you got a glimpse into these letters. I could only touch on a fraction of them. Even though it's not a large collection, there's a lot of meat in these letters. So they definitely each letter deserves to be taken independently and explored independently. So that's why we're trying to make this accessible to everybody.